everyone, welcome back to my channel Escape to Storyland. Today I'm back again with another short story of Sherlock Holmes' adventure called The Man with the Twisted Lip by Arthur Conan Doyle. Before I start, do subscribe to my channel, do hit the like button and the bell icon for further notification. One night, it was in June 1989. There came a ring to my bell, about the hour when a man gives his first yawn and glances at the clock. I sat up in my chair, and my wife laid her needlework down in her lap and made a little face of disappointment. "A patient?" she said. "You'll have to go out," I groaned, for I just came back from a very tiring day. We heard the door open, a few hurried words, and then quick steps on the stairs. Our own door flew open, and a lady, clad in some dark-colored stuff with a black veil, entered the room. "You will excuse my calling so late," she began, and then, suddenly losing her self-control, she ran forward, threw her arms about my wife's neck, and sobbed upon her shoulder. "Oh, I'm in such trouble," she cried. "I do so want a little help." "Why," said my wife, pulling up her veil, "it is Kate Whitney. How you startled me, Kate. I had not an idea who you were when you came in. I didn't know what to do, so I came straight to you." That was always the way. People who were in grief came to my wife like a bird to a lighthouse. "It was very sweet of you to come. Now, you must have some wine and water and sit here comfortably and tell us all about it. Or should you rather that I sent James off to bed?" "Oh, no. I want the doctor's advice and help too. It's about Isa. He has not been home for 2 days. I'm so frightened about him." It was not the first time that she had spoken to us of her husband's trouble. To me as a doctor, to my wife as an old friend and school companion. We soothed and comforted her by such words as we could find. Did she know where her husband was? Was it possible that we could bring him back to her? It seems that it was. She had the surest information that of late, when the fit was on him, made use of an opium den in the farthest east of the city. Previously, his orgies had always been confined to one day, and he had come back, twitching and shattered, in the evening. But now the spell had been upon him for 4 days, and he lay there, feeding in the poison or sleeping off the effects. There he was to be found, she was sure of it, at the Bar of Gold, in Upper Swan Dam Lane. But what was she to do? How could she, a young and timid woman, make her way in such a place and pluck her husband out from among the ruffians who surrounded him? There was the case, and of course there was but one way out of it. Might I not escort her to this place? And then, as a second thought, why should she come at all? I was Isa Whitney's medical advisor, and as such I had influence over him. I could manage it better if I was alone. I promised her on my own word that I would send him home in a cab within 2 hours, if he were indeed at the address which she had given me. And so, in 10 minutes, I had left my armchair and cherry sitting room behind me, and was speeding eastward in a cab on a strange errand. as it seemed to me at the time, though the future only could show how strange it was to be. But there was no great difficulty in the first stage of my adventure. I found the den of which I was in search. Ordering my cab to wait, I passed down the steps, and by the light of a flickering oil lamp above the door, I found the latch and made my way into a long, low room, thick and heavy with the brown opium smoke. Through the gloom, one could dimly catch a glimpse of bodies lying in a strange, fantastic position. Bowed shoulders, bent knees, head thrown back, and chin pointing upward, with here and there a dark, lackluster eyes turned upon me. At the further end of the room sat a tall, thin old man with his jaw resting upon his two fists and his elbows upon his knees, staring into the fire. As I entered, a shallow attendant had hurried up with a pipe for me and a supply of drug, calling me to an empty berth. "Thank you. I have not come to stay," said I. "There is a friend of mine here, Mr. Iser Whitney, and I wish to speak with him." There was a moment and an exclamation from my right, and peering through the gloom, I saw Whitney, pale, haggard, and unkempt, staring out at me. "My God, it's Watson," said he. He was in a pitiable state. "I say, Watson, what o'clock is it?" "Nearly 11. "Of what day?" "Of Friday, June 19th. "Good heavens! I thought it was Wednesday." "It is Wednesday. What do you want to frighten a chap for?" He sank his face onto his arms and began to sob. "I tell you that it is Friday, man. Your wife has been waiting for 2 days for you. You should be ashamed of yourself." "So I am. But you've got mixed, Watson. For I have only been here for a few hours. 3 pipes. Four pipes. I forgot how many. But I'll go home with you. I wouldn't frighten Kate. Poor little Kate. Give me your hand. Have you a cab?" "Yes, I have one waiting." "Then I shall go on in it." "But I must owe something. Find what I owe, Watson. I am all of color. I can do nothing for myself." I walked down the narrow passage between the double row of sleepers, holding my breath to keep out the wild smell of drug, and looking about for the manager. As I passed the tall man who sat near the door, I felt a sudden pull at my shirt, and a low voice whispered, "Walk past me and then look back at me." The word fell quite distinctly upon my ear. I glanced down. They could have come from the old man at my side, and yet he sat now as absorbed as ever, very thin, very wrinkled, bent with age, an opium pipe dangling down from between his knees. I took 2 steps forward and looked back. It took all my self-control to prevent me from breaking out into a cry of astonishment. He was none other than Sherlock Holmes. He made a slight motion to me to approach him. "Holmes?" I whispered. "What on earth are you doing in this place?" "As low as you can," he answered. "I have excellent ears. If you would have the great kindness to get rid of that Scottish friend of yours, I should be exceedingly glad to have a little talk with you. I have a cab outside." "Then pray send him home in it. You may safely trust him, for he appears to be limp to get into any mischief. I should recommend you Also to send a note by the cabman to your wife to say that you would be late as you have met me. If you will wait outside, I shall be with you in 5 minutes. It was difficult to refuse any of Sherlock Holmes' requests, for they were always so exceedingly definite and put forward with such a quiet air of mastery. In a few minutes, I had written my note, paid Whitney's bill, led him out to the cab, and see him drive through the darkness. In a very short time, a weak figure had emerged from the opium den, and I was walking down the street with Sherlock Holmes. For 2 streets he shuffled along with a bent back and an uncertain foot. Then, glancing quickly round, he straightened himself out and burst into a hearty fit of laughter. "I suppose, Watson," said he, "that you imagine that I have added opium smoking to cocaine injections and all the other little weaknesses to which you favored me with your medical views. I was certainly surprised to find you there, but not more so than I to find you. I came to find a friend, and I came to find an enemy." "An enemy?" "Yes, one of my natural enemies, or shall I say my natural prey. Briefly, Watson, I am in the midst of a very remarkable inquiry, and I have hoped to find a clue in these drug dens, as I have done now before. Had I been recognized in that den, my life would not have been worth an hour of purchase, for I have used it before now, for my own purposes. And that rascal Lasker who runs it has sworn to have vengeance upon me. It is the vilest murder trap on the whole riverside, and I fear that Neville St. Clair has entered it never to leave it more. But our trap should be here." He put his 2 forefingers between his teeth and whistled shrilly, a signal which was answered by a similar whistle from the distance, followed shortly by the rattle of wheels and the clink of horses' hoofs. "Now, Watson," said Holmes, "you'll come with me, won't you?" "If I can be of any use," I said. "Oh, a trusty comrade is always of use, and a chronicler still more so. My room at the Cedars is a double-bedded one." "The Cedars?" "Yes, that is Mr. St. Clair's house. I am staying there while I conduct the inquiry." "Where is it then?" "Near Lee, in Kent. We have a 7-mile drive before us." "But I'm all in the dark," I said. "You'll know all about it presently. Jump up here." "All right, John, we shall not need you. Here's £50. Look out for me tomorrow about 11. Give her her head. So long then." Holmes drove in silence, with his head sunk upon his breast, and the air of a man who's lost in thought. We had driven several miles, and were beginning to get a fringe of the belt of suburban villas, when he shook himself, shrugged his shoulders, and lit up his pipe with the air of a man who has satisfied himself that he is acting for the best. You have a great gift of silence, Watson," said he. "It makes you quite invaluable as a companion. It is a great thing for me to have someone to talk to, for my own thoughts are not over pleasant. I was wondering what I should say to this dear little woman tonight, when she meets me at the door." "You forgot that I know nothing about it. I shall have the time to tell you the facts of the case before we get to leave. It seems absurdly simple and yet somehow I can get nothing to get upon it. There's plenty of thread, no doubt, but I can't get the end of it into my hand. Now I'll state the case clearly and consciously to you, and maybe you can see a spark where all is dark to me. Proceed then. Well, some years ago, in May 1884, there came to me a gentleman, Neveri St. Clair, who appeared to have plenty of money. He took a large villa, laid out the grounds very nicely, and lived generally in a good style. By degrees, he made friends in the neighborhood, and in 1887 he married the daughter of a local brewer, by whom he now has 2 children. He had no occupation, but was interested in several companies and went into town as a rule in the morning, returning by 5:14 from Cannon Street every night. Mr. St. Clair is now 37 years of age, is a man of temperate habits, a good husband, a very affectionate father, and a man who is popular with all who know him. I may add that his whole debt at the present moment, as far as we have been able to ascertain, amount to £88, while he has £220 standing to his credit in the Capital and Countries Bank. There is no reason, therefore, to think that money troubles have been weighing upon his mind. Last Monday, Mr. St. Clair went into town rather earlier than usual, remarking before he started that he had 2 important work to finish, and that he would bring his little boy home a box of grapes. Now, by the merriest chance, his wife received a telegram upon the same Monday, very shortly after his departure, to the effect that a small parcel of considerable value, which she had been expecting, was waiting for her at the office of Aberdeen Shipping Company. Now, if you are well up in your London, you will know that the office company is in Fresno Street, which branches out of Upper Swandown Lane, where you found me tonight. Mrs. St. Clair had her lunch and left for the city, did some shopping, proceeded to the company's office, got her packet, and found herself at exactly 4:35 walking through Swandown Lane, on her way back to the station. Have you followed me so far? It is very clear. If you remember, Monday was an exceedingly hot day, and Mrs. St. Clair walked slowly, glancing about in the hope of seeing a cab, as she did not like the neighborhood in which she found herself. While she was walking in this way down Swandown Lane, she suddenly heard a loud cry and was struck cold to see her husband looking down at her, and, as it seemed to her, beckoning to her from a second-floor window. The window was open, and she distinctly saw his face, which she describes as being terribly agitated. He waved his hand frantically to her, and then vanished from the window so suddenly that it seemed to her that he had been pulled back by some irresistible force behind him. One thing she noticed was that although he wore some dark coat, he had on neither collar nor necktie. Convinced that something was amiss with him, she rushed down the steps, for the house was none other than the opium den in which you found me tonight. And running through the front room, she attempted to ascend the stairs which led to the first floor. At the foot of the stairs, however, she met this Lascar scoundrel of whom I have spoken, who thrust her back, and Dane, who acts as an assistant there, pushed her out into the street. Filled with the most maddening doubts and fear, she rushed down the lane, and by rare good fortune, met in Fresno Street a number of constables with an inspector. The inspector and two men accompanied her back, and in spite of the continued resistance of the proprietor, they made their way to the room in which Mr. St. Clair had been last seen. There was no sign of him there. In fact, in the whole of that floor, there was no one to be found. Both Dane and Lasker swore that no one else had been in that room during the afternoon. So determined was their denial that the inspector was staggered and had almost come to believe that Mrs. St. Clair had been deluded when, with a cry, she sprang at a small deal box which lay upon the table and tore the lid from it. Out there fell a casket of children's bricks. It was the toy which he had promised to bring home. This discovery made the inspector realize that the matter was serious. The rooms were carefully examined and results all pointed to a horrible crime. On examination, traces of blood were to be seen upon the window sill, and several scattered drops were visible upon the wooden floor of the bedroom. Thrust away behind a curtain in the front room were all the clothes of Mr. St. Clair, with the exception of his coat. His boots, his socks, his hats, and his watch, all were there. There were no sign of violence upon any of these garments, and there were no other traces of Mr. St. Clair. Out of the window he must apparently have gone, for no other exit could be discovered, and the ominous bloodstains upon the sill gave a little promise that he could save himself by swimming, for the tide was at its highest at the moment of the tragedy. The Lascar was known to be a man of the wildest man of crimes, but as by Mrs. St. Clair's story, he was known to have been at the foot of the stair within a few seconds of her husband's appearance at the window. He could hardly have been more than an accessory to the crime. His defense was one of absolute ignorance, and he protested that he had no knowledge as to the doings of Hugh Bourne, his lodger, and that he could not account in any way for the presence of the missing gentleman's clothes. Now, for the sinister cripple who lives upon the second floor of the opium den, and who was certainly the last human being whose eyes rested upon Mr. St. Clair. His name? Hugh Bourne, and his hideous face is one which is familiar to every man who goes to the city. He is a professional beggar, though, in order to avoid the police regulations, he pretends to be a small trade in wax vesters. His appearance, you see, is so remarkable that no one can pass him without observing him. A shock of orange hair, a pale face disfigured by a horrible scar, which by its contraction has turned up on the outer edge of his upper lip, a bulldog chin, and a pair of very penetrating dark eyes, which present a singular contrast to the colour of his hair, all marks him out from amidst the common crowd of beggars. And so, too, does his wit, for he is ever ready with a reply to any piece of chaff which may be thrown at him by the passer-by. This is the man whom we now learn to have been the lodger at the opium den, and to have been the last man to see the gentleman of whom we are in quest. But a cripple? Said I. What could he have done single-handed against a man in the prime of life? He is a cripple in the sense that he walks with a limp, but in other respects he appears to be a powerful and well-matured man. Surely your medical experience would tell you, Watson, that weakness in one limb is often compensated by the exceptional strength in the other. Pray, continue your narrative. Well, Mrs. St. Clair had fainted at the sight of the blood upon the window, and she was escorted home in a cab by the police, as her presence could be of no help to them in their investigation. Inspector Barton, who had charge of the case, made a very careful examination of the premises, but without finding anything which threw any light upon the matter. One mistake had been made in not arresting Boone instantly, as he was allowed some few minutes during which he might have communicated with his friend the Lascar. But this fault was soon fixed, and he was seized and searched without anything being found which could incriminate him. There were, it is true, some blood stains upon his right shirt sleeve, but he pointed to his ring finger, which had been cut near the nail, and explained that the bleeding came from there, adding that he had been to the window not long before, and the stains which had been observed there came doubtless from the same source. He denied strenuously having ever seen Mr. Clare, and swore that the presence of the clothes in his rooms were much of a mystery to him as to the police. As to Mrs. St. Clair's assertion that she had actually seen her husband at the window, he declared that she must have been either mad or dreaming. He was removed loudly protesting to the police station, while the inspector remained upon the premises in the hope that the ebbing tide might afford some fresh clue. And it did, though they hardly found upon the mud bank what they had feared to find. It was Mr. St. Clair's coat, and not his body. And what do you think they found in the pockets? I cannot imagine, I said. No, I don't think you would guess. Every pocket stuffed with pennies and half pennies. 421 pennies and 270 half pennies. It was no wonder that it had not been swept away by the tide. But a human body is a different matter. It seemed likely enough that the weighted coat had remained when the stripped body had been sucked away into the river. But I understand that all other clothes were found in the room. Would the body be dressed in a coat alone? No, sir, but the facts might be met speciously enough. Suppose that this man Boone had thrust Mr. Clare through the window. There is no human eye which could have seen the deed. What would he do then? It would of course instantly strike him that he must get rid of the telltale garments. He would seize the coat, then, and be in an act of throwing it out, when it would occur to him that it would swim and not sink. He has little time, for he has heard the scuffle downstairs when the wife tried to force her way up, and perhaps he had already heard from his Lascar confederate that the police are hurrying up the streets. There is not an instant to be lost. He rushes to some secret hoard where he has accumulated the fruits of his begging, and he stuffs all the coins upon which he lays his hand into the pocket to make sure of the coat sinking. He throws it out, and would have done the same with the other garments, had not he heard the rush of steps below, and only just had time to close the window when the police appeared. It certainly sounds feasible, I said. Well, we will take it as a working hypothesis, for want of a better. Boone, as I have told you, was arrested and taken to the station, but it could not be shown that there had ever been before anything against him. He had for years been known as a professional beggar, but his life appeared to have been a quiet and innocent one. There the matter stands at present, and the questions which have to be solved. What Mr. Clare was doing in the opium den? What happened to him when he was there? Where is he now? And what does his hue bone has to do with his disappearance? Are all as far from a solution as ever. I confess that I cannot recall any case within my experience which looked at the first glance so simple and yet which presented such difficulties. But why are you not conducting the case from Baker Street? I asked. Because there are many inquiries which must be made out here. Mrs. St. Clair has most kindly put 2 rooms at my disposal, and you may rest assured that she will have nothing but a welcome for my friend and colleague. I hate to meet her, Watson, when I have no news of her husband. Here we are. As we approached the door, a little blonde woman stood in the opening. Well? She cried. Well? And then, seeing that there were 2 of us, she understood and shook her head. No good news? None. No bad? No. Thank God for that. But come in. You must be tired, for you have had a long day. This is my friend Dr. Watson. He has been of most vital use to me in several of my cases, and a lucky chance has made it possible for me to bring him out and associate him with this investigation. I am delighted to see you, she said, pressing my hand warmly. You will, I am sure, forgive anything that may be wanting in our arrangement when you consider the blow which has come so suddenly upon us. My dear madam, said I am an old campaigner, and if I were not, I can very well see that no apology is needed. If I can be of any assistance, either to you or to my friend, I shall be indeed happy. Now, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, said the lady as we entered a well-lit dining room, upon the table of which a cold supper had been laid out. I should very much like to ask you 1 or 2 plain questions, to which I beg that you will give a plain answer. Certainly, madam. Do not trouble about my feelings. I am not hysterical, nor given to fainting. I simply wish to hear your real opinion. Upon what point? In your heart of hearts, do you think Mr. Clare is alive? Sherlock Holmes seemed to be embarrassed by the question. Frankly, now? She repeated, standing upon the rug and looking keenly down at him as he leaned back in the basket chair. Frankly then, madam, I do not. You think that he is dead? I do. Murdered? I don't say that, perhaps. And on what day did he meet his death? On Monday. Then perhaps, Mr. Holmes, you will be good enough to explain how it is that I received a letter from him today. Sherlock Holmes sprang out of his chair as if he had been galvanized. What? He roared. Yes, today. She stood smiling, holding up a little slip of paper in the air. May I see it? Certainly. The envelope was a very coarse one and was stamped with a Gravesend postmark and with the date of that very day, or rather the day before, for it was considerably after midnight. Coarse written, murmured Holmes. Surely this is not your husband's handwriting, madam? No, but the enclosure is. I perceive also that whoever addressed the envelope had to go and inquire as to the address. How can you tell? The name, you see, is in perfectly black ink, which has dried itself. The rest is of the greyish colour, which shows that blotting paper has been used. If it had been written straight off and then blotted, none would be of a deep black shade. This man has written the name and there has been a pause before he wrote the address, which can only mean that he was not familiar with it. Let us now see the letter. Ha! There has been an enclosure here. Yes, there was a ring. His signet ring. And you sure that this is your husband's hand? One of his hands. One? His hand when he wrote hurriedly. It is very unlikely his usual handwriting, and yet I know it well. Dearest, do not be frightened. All will come well. There is a huge error which it may take some time to rectify. Wait in patience. Writing in pencil upon the fly leaf of a book, octave size, no watermark. Posted to date in Gravesend by a man with a dirty thumb. Ha! And the flap has been wound. If I'm not very much in error, by a person who had been chewing tobacco. And you've no doubt that this is your husband's hand, madam? None. Mr. Clare wrote those words. And they were posted today at Gravesend? Well, Mrs. St. Clair, the clouds lighten, though I should not venture to say that the danger is over. But he must be alive, Mr. Holmes. Unless this is a clever forgery to put us on the wrong scent. The ring, after all, proves nothing. It may have been taken from him. No, it is his very own handwriting. Very well. It may, however, have been written on Monday and only posted today. That is possible. If so, many have happened between. Oh, you must not discourage me, Mr. Holmes. I know that all is well with him. There is so keen a sympathy between us that I should know if evil came upon him. On the very day that I saw him last, he cut himself in the bedroom, and yet I was in the dining room, and I rushed upstairs instantly with the utmost certainty that something had happened. Do you think that I would respond to such a way and yet be ignorant of his death? In this letter, you certainly have a strong piece of evidence to corroborate your view. But if your husband is alive and able to write letter, why should he remain away from you? I cannot imagine. It is unthinkable. And on Monday, he made no remarks before leaving you? No. And you were surprised to see him in Swandam Lane? Very much so. Was the window open? Yes. Then he might have called to you. He might? He only, as I understand, gave an inarticulate cry. Yes. A call for help, he thought. Yes, he waved his hands. But it might have been a cry of surprise. Astonishment at the unexpected sight of you might cause him to throw up his hands. It is possible. And you thought he was pulled back. He disappeared so suddenly. He might have leaped back. You did not see anyone else in that room? No, but this horrible man confessed to have been there, and the Lascar was at the foot of the stairs. Quite so. Your husband, as far as you could see, had his ordinary clothes on? But without his collar or tie, I distinctly saw his bare throat. Had he ever spoken of Swandam Lake? Never. Had he ever showed any sign of having taken opium? Never. Thank you, Mrs. Clare. Those are the principal points about which I wish to be absolutely clear. We shall now have a little supper and then retire, for we may have a very busy day tomorrow. We had our supper and then retired to bed. Awake, Watson? He asked. Yes. Game for a morning drive? Certainly. Then dress. No one is stirring yet. But I know where the stable boy sleeps, and we shall soon have the trap out. As I dressed, I glanced at my watch. It was no wonder that no one was stirring. It was 25 minutes past 4. I had hardly finished when Holmes returned with news that the boy was putting in the horse. I want to test a little theory of mine, said he, pulling on his boots. I think, Watson, that you are now standing in the presence of one of the most absolute fools in Europe. I deserve to be kicked from here to Charing Cross. But I have the key of the affair now. And where is it? I asked, smiling. In the bathroom, he answered. Oh yes, I'm not joking. He continued, seeing my look of incredulity. I have just been there, and I have taken it out, and I have got it in this Gladstone bag. Come on, my boy, and we shall see whether it will not fit the lock. We made our way downstairs as quietly as possible, and out into the bright morning sunshine. It has been in some point a singular case, said Holmes, flicking the horse on into a gallop. I confess that I have been blind as a mole, but it is better to learn wisdom late than never to learn it at all. Passing down the Waterloo Bridge, we crossed over the river, and dashing up Wellington Street, wheeled sharply to the right, and found ourselves in Bow Street. Sherlock Holmes was well known to the force, and 2 constables at the door saluted him. One of them held the horse's head, while the other led us in. Who is on duty? Inspector Bradstreet, sir. Ah, Bradstreet, how are you? A tall, stout official had come down the stone-flagged passage in a peaked cap and frocked jacket. I wish to have a quiet word with you, Bradstreet. Certainly, Mr. Holmes. Step into my room here. What can I do for you, Mr. Holmes? I called about that beggar man, Boone, the one who was charged with being concerned in the disappearance of Mr. Clare of Lee. Yes, he was brought up and remanded for further inquiries. So I heard. You have him here? In the cells. Is he quiet? Oh, he gives no trouble. But he is a dirty scoundrel. Dirty? Yes. It is all we can do to make him wash his hands. And his face is as black as a tinker's. Well, when once his case has been settled, he will have a regular prison bath. And I think if you saw him, you would agree with me that he needed it. I should like to see him very much. Would you? That is easily done. Come this way. You can leave your bag. No, I think I'll take it. Very good. Come this way, if you please. He led us down a passage, opened a barred door, passed down a winding stair, and brought us to a whitewashed corridor with a line of doors on each side. The third on the right is his, said the inspector. Here it is. He is asleep, said he. You can see him very well. The prisoner lay with his face towards us, in a deep sleep, breathing slowly and heavily. He was a middle-sized man, with a coloured shirt protruding through the rent in his tattered coat. He was, as the inspector had said, extremely dirty. But the grime was covered, but the grime which covered his face could not conceal its repulsive ugliness. There was a twitch on his lip, and his hair was orange. "He is a beauty, isn't he?" said the inspector. "He certainly needs a wash," remarked Holmes. "I had an idea that he might, and I took the liberty of bringing the tools with me." He opened the Gladstone bag as he spoke and took out, to my astonishment, a very large bath sponge. "You're a funny one," chuckled the inspector. "Now, if you will have the great goodness to open the door very quietly, we will soon make him cut a much more respectable figure." "Well, I don't know why not." He slipped his key into the lock, and we all very quietly entered the cell. The sleeper half turned and then settled down once more in a deep slumber. Holmes stooped to the water jug, moistened his sponge, and then rubbed it twice vigorously across and down the prisoner's face. "Let me introduce you," he shouted, "to Mr. St. Clair of Lee, in the country of Kent." Never in my life have I seen such a sight. The man's face peeled off under the sponge like a bark from a tree. Gone was the coarse brown tint, and the twisted lip which was given the repulsive sneer to the face. He, up in his bed, was a pale, sad-faced, refined-looking man, black-haired and smooth-skinned, rubbing his eyes and staring about him with a sleepy bewilderment. Then, suddenly realizing the exposure, he broke into a scream and threw himself down with his face to the pillow. "Great heavens!" cried the inspector. "It is indeed the missing man! I know him from the photograph." The prisoner turned with the reckless air of a man who abandons himself to his destiny. "Be it so," said he. "And pray, what am I charged with?" "With making away with Mr. St. Clair." "Oh, come on. You can't be charged with that unless they make a case of attempted suicide of it," said the inspector with a grin. "Well, I have been 27 years in the force, but this really takes the cake. If I am Mr. St. Clair, then it is obvious that no crime has been committed, and that therefore I am illegally detained." "No crime, but a very great error has been committed," said Holmes. "You would have done better to have trusted your wife." "It was not the wife, it was the children. God help me, I would not have them ashamed of their father. My God, what an exposure! What can I do?" Sherlock Holmes sat down beside him on the couch and patted him kindly on the shoulder. "If you leave it to the court of law to clear the matter up," said he, "of course you can hardly avoid publicity. On the other hand, if you convince the police authorities that there is no possible case against you, I do not know that there is any reason that the details should find their way into the papers. Inspector Bradstreet would, I'm sure, make notes on anything which might tell us and submit it to the proper authorities. The case would then never go into the court at all." "God bless you!" cried the prisoner passionately. "I would have endured imprisonment, even execution, rather than have left my miserable secret as a family blot to my children. You are the first who have ever heard my story. My father was a schoolmaster in Chesterfield, where I received an excellent education. I travelled in my youth, took to the stage, and finally became a reporter on an evening paper in London. One day, my editor wished to have a series of articles on begging in the metropolis, and I volunteered to supply them. There was the point from which all my adventures started. It was only by trying begging as an amateur that I could get the facts upon which to base my articles. When I was an actor, I had of course learned all the secrets of making up and had been famous in the green room for my skills. I took advantage now of my attainments. I painted my face, and to make myself as pitiable as possible, I made a good scar and fixed one side of my lips to a twist by the aid of a small slip of flesh colored plaster. For 7 hours I plied my trade, and when I returned home the evening, I found to my surprise that I had received no less than £26. Well, you can imagine how hard it was to settle down to hard work at £2 a week when I knew that I could earn as much in a day by smearing my face with a little paint and laying my cap on the ground and sitting still. It was a long fight between my pride and the money, but the dollars won at last, and I threw up reporting and sat day after day in the corner which I had first chosen, inspiring pity by my ghastly face and filling my pockets with copper. Only one man knew my secret. He was the keeper of the low den in which I used to lodge in Swan. This fellow, a Lascar, was well paid by me for his rooms, so that I knew that my secret was safe in his possession. As I grew richer, I grew more ambitious, took a house in the country, eventually married, without anyone having a suspicion as to my real occupation. My dear wife knew that I had a business in the city. She little knew what. Last Monday, I had finished for the day and was dressing in my room about the opium den when I looked out my window and saw, to my horror and astonishment, that my wife was standing in the street with her eyes fixed upon me. I gave a cry of surprise, threw up my arms to cover my face, and rushing to my confidant, the Lascar, entreated him to prevent anyone from coming up to me. I heard her voice downstairs, but I knew that she could not ascend. Swiftly I threw my clothes and put on those of a beggar along with a wig. Even a wife's eye could not see through my disguise. But then it occurred to me that there might be a search in the room, and that the clothes might betray me. I threw open the window, reopening by my violence a small cut which I inflicted upon myself in the bedroom that morning. Then I seized my coat, which was weighted by coppers, which I had just transferred to it from the leather bag in which I carried my takings. I hurled it out the window and it disappeared into the Thames. The other clothes would have followed, but at the moment there was a rush of constables up the stairs, and a few minutes after that I confessed to my relief, that instead of being identified as Mr. St. Clair's, I was arrested as a murderer. That note only reached her yesterday, said Holmes. Good God, what a week she must have had spent. That was it, said Holmes. I have no doubt about it. But have you never been prosecuted for begging? Many times, but what was a fine to me? It must stop here, however. If the police are here to hush things up, there must be no more of you going, said Bradstreet. I have sworn it by the most solemn oath which a man can take, said the prisoner. In that case, I think that it is probable that no further steps may be taken. But if you are found again, then all must come out. I am sure, Mr. Holmes, that we are very much indebted to you for having cleaned up the matter. I wish I knew how to reach to your result. I reached this one, said my friend. I think, Watson, that if we drive to Baker Street, we shall just be in time for breakfast. That was the end of our story, The Man with the Twisted Lip. Thank you so much for listening to it. I hope you all enjoyed the story. I will be back again with another amazing short story or with another amazing short adventure of Sherlock Holmes. Thank you so much for tuning in today. And before you leave, please do not forget to subscribe to my channel